Hi, this is my video response to Multiverso Distópico's recent video, The Death of Characters. I'm going to put a link in the description below because it's a really good video. Multiverso Distópico shares his opinions and his experiences related to this difficult subject. So it's definitely something worth looking into, and that's why I'm making a response, because it's something that many players and game masters have experienced, that sometimes it's somewhat of a difficult process or event, but I also think that it could bring some positive things to adventures and campaigns. Now, why is it that it's so difficult to deal with character death in role-playing games when compared to other forms of entertainment such as board games and video games? Well, this is highly related, in my opinion, to the process of character creation and development or advancement during an adventure or a campaign. When you create a character, you put a lot of yourself into that specific character. Even if you try to remain somewhat detached, you still put some time and thought into that player and that character, his special powers, his background story, rolling his stats, etc. Now, many role-playing games have different systems. Some have a relatively quick way to generate a character and not as involved, and in those games the character feels more like an expendable resource for you to experience the game world. But other games are a bit more complex and deep during character creation. So for example, we have Hackmaster, Anima Beyond Fantasy, Fight Round 1. In those games you put a lot of thinking into distributing your points between the stats and different powers and abilities. You pick flaws and some advantages. Some of them you even have to design the special attacks or techniques from scratch, and they are quite crunchy, so it does take a bit of time creating your character. In the best case scenario, when you're really familiar with the system and you have a clear idea of what you want to create, you probably just take about 15 or 20 minutes. But there are moments when you are really thinking about the things that you want your character to express or represent, and it's a very deep, complex, and even crunchy system. So the process could actually take an hour or even two, perhaps even a bit more if you want sort of like a party theme or specific cohesion, because some players could be like, oh no, you created that character that doesn't make sense with the rest of the party, or we already have too many melee fighters. Or if it's more of a narrative game, the theme of a particular character or the storyline could enter into sort of like a conflict with the other backstories of the other party members. So it's not as simple in those cases, and sometimes an entire session is dedicated to character creation, so it kind of feels like you're playing the game before playing the game. And it is that sense of putting a lot of effort into creation that makes it somewhat difficult to digest when your character gets killed. And when it comes to advancement in an adventure or in a campaign, that is when you gain experience points and you start leveling up your character. You're still putting a lot of you into that. You're thinking, what kind of feat I'm going to get from my character next, or maybe what kind of spell or psionic power. You put a lot of thought into that, and you start having adventures and surviving different situations. And when your character dies, it feels like everything goes down the drain. So I think that's part of why character death is usually perceived in a negative way. There are some ways around this. So for example, in many fantasy role-playing games, there is usually a spell or some type of mechanism to bring your character back from the dead. Maybe you could have like an adventure, try to rescue him from Hades or whatever the place that character is in. And so I'm talking about those cases where that's not possible. Even in those fantasy games, there is a chance that an enemy uses some sort of like disintegration attack, or maybe that enemy swallows your character's soul or something, and it's not possible to bring back that character. So you really do feel that sense of loss and regret that, oh, I shouldn't have done that, I attacked that enemy so carelessly and such. Or maybe you fell down some weird trap or whatever. So in those cases, yes, it could feel a bit negative. Now, before we continue with player character death, let's cover a bit of non-player character death, because I think that's a lot easier to handle. Non-player characters feel more detached from the players, because they aren't using those non-player characters as a vehicle to experience the adventure. Rather, they are there to make the game world come alive with your character interacting with those non-player characters. So I think it's a bit easier to handle non-player character death, because you could use it as a sort of like a plot device to move things further into a certain direction. And the player characters and the players specifically are going to feel quite motivated with the character death if for example, if the non-player character was friendly towards them. Maybe it was a friendly shopkeeper who usually gave them really good discounts, or maybe it was sort of like a patron that gave them a lot of jobs and clues. And when that non-player character gets killed, the party takes it quite personal, like they want to get revenge, perhaps kill the villain that eliminated that non-player character. Or maybe it's an entire organization. Maybe, for example, if it's the Forgotten Realms, maybe it was a member of the Zentarim or the Red Wizards of Thay. So the party could like make it an objective to eliminate or at least put a damper on the plans of those organizations that were responsible for killing that non-player character. However, I do think that there could be a bit of frustration when the non-player character gets killed in a moment where the player characters could have done something to prevent it, and everything felt too arbitrary or mandatory. So for example, maybe there's this huge battle where everybody's protecting this city from an orc attack, and just a few, let's say 20 feet away, there's the captain of the guard that is a friend for the player characters. And the game master suddenly says, oh, that captain of the guard got surrounded by 20 orcs and they killed him, just like that. And the player characters are going to feel somewhat cheated because they didn't even have a chance to try to protect the captain of the guard. So if you're going to do something like that, you really have to make sure that they don't have a chance to rescue him, only if it's really important for that character to die. So maybe that character could have been killed about perhaps 100 feet away, and they just heard, oh, the captain of the guard has been killed, and they look and they see the orcs killing him, and maybe they get really angry and we're going to avenge him. But in generally, if you're going to try to kill a non-player character when the player characters are there on a specific battlefield, it's usually good to give them an opportunity to save that player character. And if they manage to do that, I think the non-player character, deserves to be alive. But still, and I also think that the death of non-player characters could serve as a way to enhance the theme of a game. So for example, maybe you're running a horror game, and this is probably quite obvious for many experienced dungeon masters or game masters. And in a horror game, many times the player characters feel somewhat uneasy and ignorant of the situation around them. And then this non-player character comes along and says something like, oh, I know about the supernatural thing that you are facing. I know its weakness, or I know a bit of what he's trying to do, and I'll tell you how to defeat that thing, or let's meet up later on, or maybe before he gets a chance to tell them more clues or information about a particular threat in a horror game. And an enemy comes in and attacks that player character, that non-player character, and kills it. Or maybe, as I was telling you, the non-player character decided to meet up with the player characters in some other place, and when they arrive, the non-player character is already dead. So then that feeling of horror, of ignorance and helplessness gets enhanced with the death of their only friend in that situation. So that's a way in which you can use the death of non-player characters to further enhance the theme. Or maybe you're playing a game where the player characters are explorers, and one of their closest friends or maybe a family member dies, and this non-player character leaves them a message, and or maybe they receive an inheritance from that non-player character, and a new adventure begins using that character death as an excuse to bring new situations and encounters into the campaign. Now let's switch back again to player character death. In my experience, I think I've had more positive experiences with player character death than with those player characters surviving, because at least in those situations that death seemed almost impossible to escape, because sometimes it develops it into a new sort of adventure path where they are trying to bring back that character from the other world, or they are trying to avenge that character. But I have seen moments that this could actually disintegrate groups. Multiverso Distópico speaks a bit about those situations, that those moments where character death could mean the end of an adventure, or players fighting in real life, getting into arguments or worse. And I think that is due to, let's say, specific issues, psychological issues related to the players. Because sometimes people get too caught up in emotions rather than feelings. Feelings as in experiencing the present, the current situation. But emotions are usually negative, as in they can't let go of a particular thing, and it messes up their views or their perception of the present game. So, for example, this is a very generic exposition of what I've seen happen in different games. But let's say a player chooses to create a character. Let's say he created a cleric, and he starts playing the game, a Dungeons and Dragons game, and suddenly he's like, oh, I don't like my cleric, I don't like healing people all the time, and I don't like turning undead, and I don't like using blunt weapons. And so he gets like annoyed with his choice of a character, and he starts playing somewhat recklessly, and he eventually gets killed. Maybe he attacks a very strong foe, or maybe falls down a pit or something, and in a way that there is no possibility to resurrect that player character. And now the player perhaps gets too frustrated and starts saying, oh no, my character died, I love that character. So they really have to look into their way of moving their player characters, of handling in the game world. Maybe that's a reason why. So, for example, in the current times, there are many role-playing games that are being streamlined or made somewhat easier, because there are a lot of people who are not experienced in role-playing games, and their first experience would usually mean a character death if they were to play an old school game, or a modern game that has some more old school sensibilities. For example, I've talked a bit about this in some other videos, and my first role-playing game experience, specifically Dungeons and Dragons experience, playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, I got my character killed. Well, admittedly, there were some things out of place. For example, my dungeon master was drunk, and he used some really powerful enemies. They were like 6 or 7 levels above our own. They were really powerful, and so in the situation, I think I could have avoided character death, perhaps by fleeing from the battle, because it was impossible to win that battle. It was a total party kill, but it was a ranger, and even though my character died, I still, and even though the dungeon master was quite terrible at running the game, all drunk and well, simply out of form. Um, I still felt quite excited, like, wow, I got killed, I need to do better next time. Maybe now I'll create a caster. And that's the type of attitude that you need to take. But you could say, well, but how am I going to take that attitude if I spent some time creating my character and I had all these hopes and wishes for that character? Well, I think that puts a lot more value into that player character, and that's what makes character death so special, because it feels like it's alive, because you have invested so many things during the process of creating that character or leveling up that character, that you feel like, oh, this character is alive, I have to be really careful with it. So that's in that sense, that's pretty cool, and that's a positive way to look at character death. And it forces you to play smart and tactical and strategic. And so that I think that sums it up, that in the most negative moments or occasions, that when a character dies, it's usually negative for the person, because that person decides to consider it as a negative thing and decides to ignore or forget about all the wonderful and incredible adventures that character had before dying, in the case you've been playing the game for a while, because there are many stories and legends with the main characters dying at a certain moment. Just read something related to, let's say, Cuchulainn or Samson, Hercules. There are just many stories with the main characters dying. Beowulf. Some of them die somewhat cinematically, but others, their deaths are quite gritty. So when your character dies, I think that you should look at it as a story, as your character dying, and that's the way it happened. It makes it more realistic. Because that's something that Multiverso Distópico talks about as well. He talks about, for example, in more, let's see, more heroic or epic or perhaps even cinematic games, and there's usually a tendency to try to keep the character alive, so that he doesn't get killed in the entire adventure, or that he only gets killed by a major villain and not by a grunt or a thug. Well, yes, I can see that point. But I generally avoid that. I always try to keep games with a lot of risk if possible. I only give chance to those players that are completely inexperienced with playing role-playing games, and sometimes they make a really bad decision, and instead of killing that character, maybe that character gets knocked out, or his weapon is taken from his hand or something. And I give, let's say, I fudge the situations when it comes to newbies, to those who are just getting started with role-playing games. But most of the time, I prefer that if a character dies, the character dies. And when it comes to the situation of, let's say, lesser enemies killing a very skilled or powerful character, like a grunt or a thug or whatever, sort of henchman kills a hero, well, I also think that it makes sense, even if the character is highly skilled or even powerful, because in real life it has happened several times. Just take a look at some stories of, for example, in the Wild West, in the Old West, you have Wild Bill and Jesse James, incredibly skilled gunmen, pretty fast on the draw, at least Wild Bill was, and very good in gunfights, and survivors. However, they still got killed, shot in the back by less skilled opponents. Although I would consider those things strategic blunders. So, for example, Jesse James got betrayed. He shouldn't have trusted that guy. Wild Bill, he took his seat in a very poor, in a strategic sense, seat, because he didn't have like a good view of the entire establishment where he was drinking and gambling. So you could say that if there were blunders, I could see that, and but they still got killed, shot by lesser skill or lesser gunmen. And so it still makes sense even if the game features heroic characters. If any of those characters gets killed by a henchman or whatever, it would still make sense in my opinion. And even if you want to play a really over the top, the hero never dies type of game, you still consider that perhaps even heavy penalties if you don't want the characters dying, because there are some games like, for example, in Savage Worlds, you have a rule where your hero doesn't die, gets knocked out, but you still like, oh, but your mission fails or whatever. And so there are ways to penalize that and still keep the game somewhat like a comic book. Even though, as I was telling you, I prefer character death, because otherwise the game could feel less than a game that is without a structure, with a way to lose or dying or winning or surviving, and it will feel more like you're telling a story. And if you're going to do it like that, when forget the dice and forget the rules and just tell a story around a table and make up things as you go, because that randomness of cards, of dice, of different tests it's what gives so many surprising and interesting and fun ways in which the story develops. I also think that, for example, in systems that use a lot of like fate points, bennies, the destiny points, what have you, they are basically the same. It's basically a currency that you can use to change the outcome of something. It's the responsibility of the player to take that currency and let's say a few of those things and save that resource for when his character is in danger of dying. Then, oh, I'm going to use this point to reroll or whatever. And all of this reminds me of why I like Hackmaster a lot, the Hackmaster role-playing game, its most recent edition, because there are many mechanisms in that game that allow you to escape death or continue playing in a way, but still you get a sense of danger and risk. They are basically two mechanisms. You have honor and you have the protege system. Now when it comes to honor, you have a value of honor, and you could spend a certain amount of points to either reroll your dice or to raise or lower the value of something that you rolled to avoid a specific outcome. And honor is quite difficult to get in Hackmaster. You have to do many things, role play appropriately, perform many heroic feats, that is things that serve as almost like material for tavern stories, and your character becomes honorable in the views of others. And more importantly than anything, it's your character sticks true to his concept. And the other system, the protege system, it's also quite effective, because you basically take a sidekick or hirelings and you start training them using experience points to level them up with you. And that way, when your main character, if your main character gets killed, you could change and you could switch to your sidekick or a hireling, and you could play as that character. Even though it may not seem that new, because there are other games that handle things similarly, the Hackmaster role-playing game has a lot more structure related to that. And there are other role-playing games that also allow you to soften character death in a way, like for example in Dungeon Crawl Classics or the Mutant Epoch, you usually create a bunch of characters and you control those characters at the same time, maybe 3 or 4 player characters. And because you're playing really deadly adventures, you usually end up with 2 or maybe just 1 of those 3 or 4 characters. So in that way, you are not kicked out of the game in a way of speaking, and you still, well, you feel bad for the loss of that character that died, but you still have those other 2 characters to play with. And that's another important point. It really has to do a lot. That is, feeling bad about character death really has to do a lot, in my opinion, with the way players behave in real life. That is their attitude towards life. Because, for example, I've played with people who are pretty good at handling things under stress, or in danger, or when in real life risk, and when they go into this deadly dungeon or some hostile environment in a role-playing game, they do not whine about those obstacles and enemies. They face something that seems like certain death. They're always trying to work within those limits, trying to find a way out that situation, or to defeat that enemy. They don't waste time. But there are other players that I was telling you that I have seen throughout the years, that when faced with a sort of, like, let's say, like a gauntlet type situation, that is a place where they have to go through, and there are many things out there to get them, to kill them, they like, oh, why me? And they get trapped in a sort of like a victim mentality, and they do not try to overcome those obstacles, and they get killed, and they suffer a lot for their character death. They usually take it quite negatively. So, for example, I remember, that was like 20 years ago, more or less. There was this guy who created a fighter, and the funny thing is that he wanted to play as a fighter, but at the same time he did not play as a fighter. That is, he was always standing behind the group, letting the wizards be the frontliners. He was a terrible player, and when he actually got killed, his character got killed, he just left the game. So it was quite bizarre. It was like he was really cowardly in the game, and he actually acted a bit like that in real life. So sometimes we act in the game as we act in real life, and I think that those of us that try to overcome obstacles in real life, I will have an easier time dealing with the death of our characters. Multiverso Distópico also spoke about when character died because another player killed it. That is, maybe and two players saw that their character concepts kind of clashed, and they decided to handle it as sort of like a battle, and one of the characters got killed. And this is possible. This, in my opinion, is a potential way to create conflict between players in real life, but not necessarily so. And it depends on different things. So, for example, maybe the game is designed to handle such things. So, for example, you have the Epoch role-playing game. That is a horror game, one of the best that I've seen. It's card-driven, and you basically play like the typical horror movie, like Friday the 13th and such. You can basically handle any horror story that you can think of. And as you know, in many horror stories and films, many of the survivors or protagonists are usually jerks that want to kill the other survivors. They usually use the other characters as a sort of like a stepping stone to survive or to save themselves. So Epoch has that mechanism. You have cards that allow you to sacrifice others so that you can save your own hide, and it's quite fun. I haven't participated as a player, but I have participated as a game master. And when my players start killing each other, it's quite hilarious. They try to save themselves. Suddenly, maybe one is playing like a little girl, and she decides to go all psycho and shove her brother against that psychopath that is chasing them, and they can actually win scenarios, even though they act like that, like villainous in a way of speaking. Yeah, and it's always quite fun, and it's always a one-shot scenario. So there isn't really an opportunity to have like hard feelings when a player betrays another player's character. There's also Term Revancho Zero, that is, it's basically like an anime game of sorts. It's kind of like cyberpunk, steampunk with samurai and ninja and such. And that game, it is expected that, well, there's a pretty good chance that one of the characters is going to become almost like the main villain by the end of the story. It's a game that revolves a lot around Eastern philosophy, and because the attachment to physical things, it's usually considered a negative thing in Eastern spirituality. If a character gets like too materialistic, he becomes the main villain of the story, and so many of the player characters or the players are expecting to fight one of their comrades by the end of the story, and again that serves to express a lot of drama, and it's quite cool to watch. But there are other role-playing games that are not one-shots and that are not built for that can still handle player character versus player character conflict. So for example, maybe you are running a Forgotten Realms campaign, and in the party you have a lawful evil assassin that serves Bane. And one of the player characters, through some events in the story, perhaps decides to turn into a character that follows Torm, that is a good god, and that puts those characters in conflict. Perhaps there will come a time when the assassin tries to kill the other character, or the other character tries to strike first. And if the players are mature and experienced role players, that situation can be handled. Although you will have to think about the repercussion, how that affects the other party members, but that could create some very interesting stories, sort of like give it a Game of Thrones sort of flavor, and it could be handled. But however, it usually takes a bit of effort, of extra work from the game master and the players. And so, for example, I generally, when a particular role-playing game system doesn't promote or isn't built to handle player character conflict as a way to develop the story, I usually avoid it altogether, and I inform my players, in this game you shouldn't try to kill each other, because and I'm quite honest with them. I tell them, because it's going to be a lot of work for me to manage the story and think of all the repercussions that the having members in the party killing each other is going to bring. And they also consider it sometimes a bit of a pain, because they have to handle how the party is going to stay together after that, or many things. And so I think player character conflict, or at least when one player character kills another player character, it's better avoided unless the system supports that. But although it is not impossible if you have mature and experienced role players. It's also quite interesting when, for example, in video games, they try to emulate that importance of character death. So, for example, there are many games that death isn't a problem. You can continue, or you can put a password or whatever in old school games. Or in the present, you just load your file. But there are other games, other roguelike games, that you have a single life and you try to finish the game with that single life, and if your character dies, you have to start all over from the beginning. And you also have some excellent games such as Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and that also feels quite jarring and sometimes depressing when your character dies, because you have souls that are basically kind of like experience points, to in a way of speaking, and when your character dies, he loses all those souls, and there is a chance to recover them, but it's not always easy, and if you fail to recover those souls, you lose them forever, so all your hard work goes down the drain. And that's a bit of a similarity between tabletop role-playing games and modern video games, that type of sense of losing something really important. So even though character death is difficult to handle, I think it could bring some positive things, some different ways in which different adventures and campaigns develop, and that sense of risk that you really can't find it anywhere else, because, well, only in real life, because you only have one life. But in role-playing games, it really makes you nervous when you have your character and you're like, I've spent so many hours leveling up this character, and now I'm facing off against this almost unbeatable foe, or trying to move around this deadly dungeon. I don't want my character to die, and that sense like gets you You feel like an adrenaline rush at times. And that's really exciting. So I would recommend that game masters, for most of the time, that they allow character death, so that the players get that rush and that sense of risk of losing it all if they are not careful. Well, thanks for watching my video. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.